So hello, Chris.
What's up, Jason?
Man, we're back.
Yeah,
We're here.
after a week break.
Yeah, it wasn't. I don't break so much. It wasn't
Yeah,
maybe the
well,
proper term, but
it was not an enjoyable thing.
yeah. Tuesday, my wife went into labor at 35 weeks, and we went to the hospital. They kept us overnight, and then put her on bed rest. And we came home, and she got the stomach virus. My son got the stomach virus. All of the grandparents got the stomach virus,
Oh, wow.
and that left me taking care of everyone. And Friday I got the stomach virus. So this is a much better week.
It's like Oprah, stomach virus. You get a stomach virus and you get a stomach virus.
That's what happened. So for those listening, today is different for us. This is episode 10, which is like a little mini milestone for us. We probably honestly didn't expect to get past like doing 2 or 3 of them.
Yeah.
So we thought today we invite a guest on our show. So this will be the first guest. And if you are involved in Ruby and Rails at all, you've probably heard Richard Schneeman. So Richard is at Heroku. You live in Austin, right?
Yeah, I do. I'm Austin, Texas.
Austin, Texas, and is part of the Rails team. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Richard, and if you want to introduce yourself more than that.
Yeah, so I've been working at Heroku going on. This is my almost 7th year. So, who says millennials only job hop? And yeah, I've been contributing to Rails for a really long time, probably just a little over 7 years. Got commit to Rails a couple years ago, where I do on the issues team. I can like merge pull requests and stuff, and also been doing a bunch of performance work as well. Recently, I have a patch that one patch. It's 5 lines, not including tests, and it makes a real world Rails app go about 10% faster, like the entire request, not just like a single part of Rails. So that's exciting. I really like doing performance work.
That is awesome. How did you end up getting into doing, working on Rails and stuff like that?
So initially it was just kind of a life goal, like a oh, hey, I'm a programmer. There's like the contributing.rubyonrails.org, and I was like, oh, wouldn't it be really cool if my name was on there? And my goal was just to like get a single commit in. Which later, I don't know if you've heard this, but there's like a theory of change, like a theory of if you want to start making a big change in your life, just start with a really small one.
Oh yeah,
like
yeah.
If you want to start flossing your teeth, don't say like I'm gonna floss. Say like I'm gonna floss one tooth.
Mm-hmm. And then take a tiny step and make it a habit, But it's easy to start that way.
Yeah, and it's like it would be absurd once your hand is in your mouth flossing that one tooth to not just floss the rest of them, right? So I don't know.
I'm pretty bad about that.
You're like one tooth, done. All right.
Yeah, I feel pretty good about that.
Yeah, that's good. Oh, I tried out one of those. I've actually been trying out one of those, the water flosser things, and that's it's a little tough on the gums at first, but it's pretty nice. Anyway, Rails, right? We're talking about Rails.
I mean, we can talk about flossing if you want.
I think it was Mitch Hedberg who said something along the lines of like, I don't smoke, but I know how hard it is to give up smoking because I've tried to start flossing.
That's awesome. I love that guy.
Yeah, so good. But yeah, so I had a couple ideas. I was like, oh, I could fix this, or I could, do this other thing. And I was really intimidated to actually make a first pull request to Rails. And I went to a conference. I was working for a company by the name of GoWall at the time. I went to a conference in Oklahoma. And a guy I'd never heard of before named Aaron Patterson was there, and he was one of the keynotes, and he wore like a brown like tuxedo like outfit or something. Anyway, I was like, who is this guy? And he mentioned that he like is part of Rails, and I had been really hesitant to make this one change. The change was whenever you made a request into Rails, and if it didn't match any routes, like it would tell you, hey, no, nothing matches this path. But it wouldn't tell you if it was a GET request or a put or like a post or anything. And it used to at some point in time, and then it stopped. And basically, I was like, oh, why don't we just put that in there? And then I tried putting that in there, and then I couldn't get a test, and that was like what freaked me out. I was like, I know testing's super important. Every pull request has to have a test. And like I showed it to him, and I like explained my conundrum of I can't get it tested, and he's like, yeah, let's just merge this in right now. And like I just opened the pull request, and like he merged it like at the conference, and I was like, what? This happens? This is like the secret club back channel access. And yeah, and so that was actually it. That was my one commit. That was my one tooth flossed for a really long time. And yeah, I think after that it was issues is what kind of got me back in the door. I run a service actually now called Code Triage, and the full sort of abbreviated story. I assume we have time.
We have more than enough time.
Okay, so there's another developer by the name of Steve Klabnik, and at one point in time, it was pointed out that like, hey, Rails issues there's a ton of issues on GitHub. There's like hundreds of issues, and there's only like 4 or 5 core people who look at the issues and read them. And so over like a weekend session or something, like multi-hour, like 16-hour, he like read through every single issue and commented on every single one of them. And everybody was like, wow, that's so amazing. And I was like, wait, really? Just reading issues is like going above and beyond for developers? And like, and then from that effort, he got commit into Rails, and then like started actually like merging pull requests and like influencing it, and then like saw people opening bugs and was like, oh, I'm going to fix that. And I was like, wow, that's really, really beneficial. But I am totally not going to sit down and do that for like 24 hours or 16 hours. And so I wrote a little script that just randomly would send me an email of one Rails issue. It's kind of like that tooth thing again. It's like, just look at this one Rails issue, totally random, and see if you can move the needle at all. If it's old, be like, hey, this is really old. Like, is this still an issue? Or if they give you, if it's a bug report, then try to reproduce the bug. If you can't, like ask for instructions. If you can reproduce it, hey, maybe, try and understand it and fix it. Or, and that was really successful for me. And I ended up getting, eventually they were like, hey, wow, you've been really good on issues, and you've made a bunch of really good calls, and we want to give you commit. We want to give you access. We want you to do this more and make it easier for you. And at the same time, I was like, oh, maybe this script thing is more useful for people in general. And I ended up turning it into a service called codetriage.com. So now today, anybody can go on, and it's not just limited to Rails. You can sign up for any project you want. And it, if you're in Ruby land, it also does documentation. So it can send you methods that are undocumented that you can write documentation for.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, it is. It's not totally polished though. Like, it's one of those things that's like just getting it to work. Everything is super hacky. It's all like, it's open source. It's like in my free time, that kind of stuff. But yeah, I have really, I would love to spend some more time working on that part of it. But yeah, and I have other people who have used Code Triage to get on other teams. And I mean, that's not the only reason to do it. So like, there's lots of different reasons. Like, some people are just like, you know what, I want to just stay in touch with this community. Or other people are, oh, I want to be a regular contributor, and I just want to, read these issues and see if I can help decrease issue count. And then there are other people who say, yes, I want to use this as kind of a springboard to go sort of above and beyond, and hopefully get commit or see what features and things we can add.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It just reminded me of like, I was in senior year of college and we were doing a Rails project, and I think I ended up making a commit into Rails because there was some bug in like group by in Active Record. And I remember just being like, oh man, I'm pretty sure this is a bug, but I'm not completely sure. And so I opened an issue and was like, does this make any sense? And But the whole process, I was like, maybe this is how I can like commit to Rails, because that for me as well was like, it was something that I wanted to do. So I opened it, the issue, and was like, hey, this doesn't seem to work right. And I basically just asked for someone to give me pointers on where do I even go to fix this. So I went and fixed it, and then, submitted a PR with no test, and they were like, okay, now you need to write tests for it. And so, what's nice was like, there's a lot of similar tests to what I was fixing. So they're like,
Mhm.
check out this test, modify it to, showcase the bug that you fixed, and walked me through that. And then I did that test really inefficiently. And he was like, look, you're making a couple extra queries here that you don't need to be doing. So, fix that. And then by the time I was done, had to commit in Rails and tests and everything. And I was like, man, this is a lot easier. And people were super friendly, and they're happy to help me, just kind of give me a nudge in the right direction when I got lost. And I really liked that because it felt so much less daunting, that first time that you make a contribution to a big project. It's like, first of all, there's a lot of things you don't really know about how, or sort of the intentions on how things should be done. So you're just kind of showing up like, hey, I think I can help, but
Mhm.
I have no idea where to begin. So it seems like that sort of project, code triage seems perfect for keeping an eye on things of, oh, this is something I maybe could contribute to, because I stumbled into a bug, which made it easy for me to pick something to work on. But if you're looking for an opportunity, you got to read through quite a few issues, I imagine, to find one that you maybe could work on.
Yeah, oh yeah. Well, I would say probably the biggest thing that it did for me was normalize the culture of the project. Like
Mm-hmm.
just reading, it's like, oh, I get an issue, and well, so sometimes people come to me in code triage and they're like, well, other people already commented on this issue. Like, what can I add? And I'm like, well, are those other people marked with that little contributor badge on GitHub? Like, then read their words that they're saying. Like, look at what they're saying and how they're saying it. It's like, if somebody, when you were just mentioning, it's like, oh, somebody kind of shepherded you through that process. And like that, that's great. And it also doesn't necessarily have to be like the full-time maintainers. For some issues, it's a little bit more complicated, like especially active record in Rails. It's like actually really hard to get a pull request through nowadays, just because it's like such a massive surface area.
Mm-hmm.
And there's all these little like sharp, tiny, jagged edges.
Right,
Um,
right.
but yeah, I mean, you're and yet that experience is actually, I would say, kind of the ideal experience where you notice something isn't quite right, and then either just go ahead and try to make a pull request, or ask and say like, can you confirm this isn't right? Yeah, for the longest time when I was using Rails, I just assumed whatever the behavior was the correct behavior. Like the implementation
Mm-hmm.
describes the correct behavior, even if the documentation doesn't agree with that, then well, the implementation must be right. And it's like, well, in that case, something's got to be wrong. No, either the documentation needs to be fixed, which is a huge like a huge task, and like contributing to documentation, updating documentation, even if it's as little as like, adding it's like, oh, you didn't add an S to the end of this word, like, thank you, like that will bother somebody else, and making that change is like the start of making an impact. um
Yeah, I mean, there's, and I think the right way to approach it when you're starting is just to, open an issue and ask the question. Like, if you're wondering whether or not this is wrong, just ask. Like, someone will show up and tell you, and then you can go make a PR out of it if you want. But if you're unsure, just ask the question, and people will be happy to be like, oh yeah, that is a typo, or the docs are wrong and the code's right, or maybe the code's wrong and the docs are right. So you can get direction if you just show up and ask the question. But it's one of those things that is very daunting the very first time you do it.
hmm yeah, well, and the best people to open those are the people who are experiencing the pain.
Yeah,
Like,
absolutely.
yeah, and like I always kind of try and stress the point that like opening up issues and like interacting via issues is open source contribution. Like we don't think of that, and like on GitHub it doesn't show up on your little graph or whatever, but it is. If nobody, like, don't assume somebody else is running into that issue and reported it. Like, if you have hit an issue, well, do look for it first and try to find it, and then maybe you can subscribe to it or whatever. But then if nobody opened up any issues or any bugs, then like nothing would work, right?
Yeah. Like I'd see that on gems all the time. Like I'll be working on something, and like, recently I was looking at somebody who was asking for help on using delayed job, and I noticed there was no option to like write a config file to define what workers you want to have running and stuff. And that was a nice feature of Sidekick. So I was like, well, why don't we just like see about porting that over to Sidekick, or from Sidekick over to delayed job or something, so you could keep track of that in your Git repo. And it's like, you post that, and then a bunch of people are like, oh yeah, I would love this. This would be great to be able to track that instead of, just write it down in a proc file or something. And so that was, one of those things where you're like, this might be a nice idea to have. And you can just go and add those pretty much anywhere, any gems. It doesn't have you, and you don't have to start with a big project like Rails. Like all these other little projects like Devise and everything, that they're still big, but they're way smaller than Rails, and they have so many opportunities to go fix things and improve them.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I actually recommend people, when they're first starting out and they just say, I want an open source contribution, but don't really know where to start, I recommend picking projects that involve you and that you're invested in, that hopefully you use day to day, and picking at least one big project like a Rails or something along those lines, and then one quote unquote small project that so I have a gem called Wicked that just allows you to do kind of like a sign up wizard inside of Rails. And I mean, I've had it for years, and I probably had like 10 pull requests. I don't know. I mean, I could probably open it up right now. Or it's just not. It just like, if you want to make a huge impact, I mean, like project wise, like going from one developer has worked on this project to 2 developers have worked on this, you are 50% of the people who've like made pull requests to this. So
yeah, that's great. I mean, I remember Wicked from way back when. Like I used it in a ton of projects, so that's funny to hear. Like I would have expected it had more contributors.
Yeah. So actually, yeah, it says, well, so there are actually 81 pull requests, which is a little more than I was saying, but a lot of them are mine. I actually use pull requests in my own workflow. So it's hard for me. I don't know if I can search by author, not me.
Yeah. Or I guess you could search for yourself and subtract.
But yeah, I mean, anyway, like compared to like if you go on to GitHub on Rails, there's like 700 open right now, like open.
Right. And even, it's valuable to go through a project like Wicked and go through those 81 and comment on like, this doesn't seem relevant anymore or whatever. Just kind of update the status of them that are unfinished or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely and it's a good way to get and have a little bit of cross-pollination between projects as well. Like if you see, oh, hey, this project has linter and they're using Rubocop to detect performance issues, like maybe we can use that on this other project. Or like they have this policy and this other project doesn't, and it just it's like, I don't know. I think part of the reason a lot of people get into open source is wanting to kind of level up as a developer.
Yep.
And that, like, when I think of what that means, that is what that means. It's like interacting with people who code differently than you. Reading code that is different than you've ever written, that does different things than you've never done before. Like I've never written an ORM. And so whenever I'm in the active record code base, sometimes I'm surprised. Oh, wow, you did it that way. You solved this problem that way. And then, maybe not immediately but often I'm able to, later on in life, I'm able to say, oh, that was a really good solution to that. I can reuse that same solution in this other problem. And it goes not just technically, but also culturally as well. I think a lot of the standard processes in contributing to open source, like good commit messages, really good pull request messages, a lot of communication, adding tests, things like that, are whenever you move to a private organization, like, you know, a company, like most of those things don't happen. Like it's really easy to just be like, oh, I'm just gonna open up a pull request and oh, nobody commented on it, like I'm gonna merge it. All of the commits are just like a work in progress or something. You know, like zero tests. Like you push it to production and everything just crashes, and it's like, why did that happen? And it's like, well, you know, maybe it's like maybe there is something to this kind of rigor and process, and it's like it can seem really heavy, but it's one of those things where the more you do it, if you just make a habit of it, then it's just like, oh, obviously I'm going to write a test. Like, obviously I'm going to actually describe this commit message. If not for somebody else, for me, 10 years later, when I look at this and I have no idea why this code does this.
Yeah. And you don't.
So something you said a minute ago, essentially like you read like active record source code and you're like, oh, that's how you do it. Reminded me, it may have even been a DHH tweet the other day that was like, the best way to learn code is just to like read it and write it.
Mm-hmm.
And that reminded me of that.
Yeah. And I actually have, so I'm a very agreeable person, I think, in life. But I noticed a thing that like people who get famous in like coding circles tend to have like really like explosive opinions. And so like I really want to write this blog post called like DHH is wrong, about all of the things that DHH and I disagree on. But then the conclusion would basically be that we're both right. And one of them is module use. So inside of Rails and inside of Ruby, DHH loves using modules. It's like, oh, you know, we need to add this. Like, oh, this file is 500 lines long. Let's split it up into 5 files of 5 modules, each 100 lines long, and then you only include them in this one place. And to me, it's like, okay, well, you have the exact same complexity in the exact same issues. It's just like now you have to search in 5 files when you're looking for this.
Yeah, that's a pattern I noticed in the writing software well series that he did on YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
It was like you like open up a control and there's like 20 includes and like no methods in the file.
Yeah. And it took me so long. I've written blog posts on like why I don't think it's a good idea, and like you can search for just my name, Schneems. I have a blog, and then I forget what it is. It's like I think I started off with a series called Good Module, Bad Module, where like I like talk about here's what I think is a good use of modules, and here's what I think is a bad use. And it took me so long to realize that why DHH was saying, hey, I do this and I like it. And it's because if you're writing code, then it's actually pretty ergonomic to just slap stuff in a module and include it, and all of it fits in your head. You know where it came from, and you understand the naming and all of these other things. But if you so as a writer of code, it's great. But if I don't spend nearly as much time writing code in Rails as I do reading code. And I would actually argue that most people actually spend way more time reading code than writing it. But it's a lot harder for me to read. And like if I'm debugging something to, like I was just saying, now I have to look in 5 different files, and I don't know the naming convention, and I don't know why this was put into that file as opposed to a different one. And so I don't necessarily think it's like he's right and I'm wrong, or you know, vice versa. But I just think it's a case of each of us has a different thing that we're optimizing for. And also whenever you're inside of somebody else's code base, you don't get to dictate how they write code, right? I don't get to go up to DHH and say, stop doing that. Or, I can. And he would just kind of laugh in my face. I see him usually about once a year, maybe at Rails comps usually. If he's and he's a great guy, very amenable, and very like easy to talk to. Very much cares like deeply about Rails and like all of his projects and Basecamp. But yeah, I mean, and it's like I think it's with I need to work and be able to work within this other coding style, whether I like it or not. And that's true of in a workplace as well. I work at Heroku. Heroku is super, I forget. I don't actually even know how many GitHub projects we have, but Heroku actually once broke GitHub for the number of projects. Like there used to be a limit on the number of GitHub projects you could have under one GitHub organization, and like Heroku was the first ever to hit that because like it's really easy to make an app on Heroku. You deploy, it's like great, we're running, and so because of that, we tend to it's not even really microservice. It is microservices, but it's not. It's not microservices in the way that you would think of it. It's just like, oh, okay, well, we're doing a marketing site for this thing. Like, or a better example is like, oh, we need a support site, a site that you can log in support tickets. Okay, well, that's now an app. Like, I need a site that does all of our documentation. Okay, that's an app. And so it's just like basically every single subdomain of Heroku is like a different app. And so like even if I regularly work on one subdomain and one part of Heroku and I have this coding style and I use it, then when I go over somewhere else, like inevitably I'm going to be using somebody else's. And so like to the benefits of reading code and the benefits of like reading other people's code that you have not written, and and again, it's not about it being like good or bad or better or anything. It's about it's really about like being pragmatic and being able to work in a day-to-day environment, regardless of kind of changing conditions, in non-ideal conditions.
Yeah. Speaking of the modules thing, like I've noticed that, like you said, as a reader, it's a whole different experience. And really, as a reader, you're trying to take a step back and figure out, when they implemented all these features, they had some high level strategy they were trying to implement. And like you were reading this code line by line and trying to decipher what their strategy was. And that can be really hard to like go up the ladder and figure out what the higher level approach was sometimes. And it's easy as a writer because you already have the mental models organized in your head, but you're trying to discover them as a reader. And that can be kind of why it can be harder to dive into some of that stuff. I know like reading some of especially reading any active record stuff, it can be really hard to wrap your head around what actually is going on here. And that's just kind of like, well, if you were more familiar with it, you would understand the higher level strategy or approach it's trying to take.
Yeah, absolutely. I like sometimes I see an open active record like pull request, and they will do a really good job describing like, okay, here's the issue that it fixes, and they link to an issue that has like a reproduction and all of this other thing, all this other stuff, and then I look at the change and it's like a one line change and makes no sense to me. Like, how on earth did that line like affect this other thing? It's kind of like the butterfly effect, where if you don't know, well, sort of the butterfly effect, like fake butterfly effect, I guess. It's like it looks like it's totally random and it looks like it would have no impact, but if you know how everything is connected and you understand the system, then it makes complete sense. Like actually, when I was working on that performance issue, well, I've been working on a bunch of performance issues with Rails, but with this one, the most impactful one recently, I was using a tool that I wrote called Derailed Benchmarks, and it basically allows you to from your CLI to boot your Rails app and then hit it with a request and benchmark it, and then give you that information back without ever having to actually open up a browser.
Oh, nice.
So it's just like, especially if you're doing benchmarking, it's nice that everything you can just like, I hit up and then enter, and then I run my benchmark. I don't have to like use my mouse. I don't have to click. I don't have to like command refresh or anything.
Mm-hmm.
So I really like a tool by Sam Saffron called Memory Profiler, and it will show you the exact line where memory was allocated. And one of the ways that I like to do performance tuning is basically just by reducing object allocation. Inside of anytime you make an array inside of Ruby, it takes a certain amount of time. Like there's no getting around that. And so if you make many arrays, it will take more time than if you make fewer arrays. And like there's some other benefits as well, just decreased memory pressure, so your GC doesn't have to run as much. You have to, ideally, hopefully use less memory in your app as it's running. If anybody's ever hit against like a Heroku dyno memory limit. But in this case, like I used code triage, and I was like, okay, it's a real world Rails app. I used derailed on it and hit it with Memory Profiler, and it kept on showing me like, hey, here's an issue in it was time value.rb, and so I looked at the code. I tried to optimize that code directly, and it was semi-successful, but ultimately kind of left it and said, all right, there's nothing else I can do. And with performance optimization, like you can either, if you see something as a hotspot, you can either make that thing faster, or one of the other things you can do is if anybody is familiar with computer science and like O notation, you just decrease the number of times it's called. So in my case, I was saying, well, instead of this being called ON times, like we can just do like not call it at all. So there's no code faster than no code, I guess. And so I figured out that the place where Rails was calling that code, opened up the source code. I put in I do puts debugging, and just use puts caller to figure out what was actually calling that method, and then backtracked it to a method inside of Active Record, which was generating a cache key from the object. So code triage uses a bunch of view caches to kind of try and speed things up, and it turns out that all of the view caches are based on updated at time, which seems reasonable. Like if the time of your object in the database changes, you want to invalidate the cache. Right. And so I looked at that and I was like, okay, I can't make that faster. And it's like, oh, well, wait a second. It looks like the issue is in time value and it's coming from here. So, well, what if we just didn't make a time value? We just need the cache key. It doesn't actually need to be a time object. It just needs to be a string. Why don't we just use the direct value from the database? And so I did some more puts debugging and found out that there was a method where you can actually get the Rails does, and this is another, like, I didn't know this until I tried, but Rails does kind of lazy attribute typecasting. Like it doesn't actually try to typecast until you call that method for the first time. And so you, instead of calling updated at, I can just call, I forget what it was. It was like before typecast underscore updated at. And boom, that immediately just cleared out, I think it was 5% of memory allocation. And originally I was like, oh, great. I made it roughly about 5% faster. Somebody kind of gave me a hard time about that. And they're like, well, is it actually 5% faster? I don't know. Generally, that's kind of like with when you're reducing memory allocation, that's kind of like a minimum bounds. And then I actually did some performance profiling, which is much more involved, like actually measuring execution time between two scripts. And it came back and it was 11.5% decrease in overall execution time for the entire page load.
Jeez. And this was just taking that value instead of turning it into like a time object, just pulling the raw value out and using that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, and this is one of those pull requests where, like, if you just look at it's a 5-line change in the seemingly like random file. And if I was to tell you what the issue was and like what I was looking at, you're like, wait a second, how does this decrease object allocations in this other like time? It like, I don't even think it was in active record. It was in some helper file, some helper, maybe active support. Not sure. But yeah, like to me, it makes total sense. And like that, if you followed that path and that pattern of what I'm trying to do and attempting to do. Now there are some caveats with the change, which is that it actually will cause everyone's cache to be invalidated if this gets merged.
It's a slightly different format.
Yep. Yeah, because previously we were turning it into a time object, and then instead of just calling toString on it, we were formatting it as, I think, basically number of microseconds since epoch time in Linux, and so now it will actually, if you look at your cache keys, if with this patch, you'll actually see a date in there, like a human readable date.
Yeah, that I'm thinking about that because recently my life has been filled with caching, and yeah, that would. Do you have a solution for like how to work around that if this gets merged in?
Oh, so well, it's interesting because this is a thing that's kind of monitored inside of Rails, but like apparently the cache key got changed in 5.2, and I mean, like I haven't looked at the details, but like based on the conversation in my pull request, like that's what other people say happened, but like sort of inadvertently, or not like inadvertently, but the people reviewing it didn't raise it as a red flag, or like it's kind of one of those things. Like if you're going to change the cache key, like that's kind of a big deal. You should have a really good reason for doing it.
Right.
And I mean, there are people from huge companies, like Basecamp itself actually serves a ton of requests, and there's some like e-commerce companies that have, I hear about their testing setups like have more servers than my production setups do. And like if they they are on Rails core, and if they tell me that they would prefer this to be merged in, like, it's kind of a good litmus test. I think one of the ways that in just kind of brainstorming that I came up with, and I'm also if anybody listening has any suggestions or things that have worked in production, please let me know. But if you can do kind of a gradual rollout, so instead of applying like as you're deploying, instead of like going from 0 to this change, go from some percentage of servers are running with this change, 1%, 10%, 20%, because that, yes, it will be slower and kind of suck on that 1% or 10% because the first request is going to be as if you had blown away your cache. Like there is no cache essentially. And so it has to, sorry. Apparently there's weed eating time. I don't know. Is that really loud for you all?
No, I can't even hear it.
Oh, hey, that's great. Okay. Well, forget I said anything. It is pretend weeding. It is Rails performance time is what it is. Yeah. So, essentially for that 1% of servers, then it is for the very first request, everything is uncached, but then, in the next request, it's like, okay, you've got things that are cached. So instead of going, let's say, yeah, we've got 5,000 servers or whatever, instead of all of them, the very first time they boot up, all of them missing their cache and all of them like trying to write a value for that cache value and just blowing up Memcached or Redis or whatever you're using, just having sort of a little bit more of a slow rollout. So hopefully, ideally, by the time you get to 100%, then the cache is not going to be hopefully it'll be warm, right? Like at least not cold. Right. So that is one thought. theoretically, actually, I mean, if we really wanted to, we could maybe go in and write some sort of a script that like looked at the individual cache keys, and if they matched a certain pattern, like pull it out and then try to like reverse it, because we have the exact same data. Like we have the U seconds or whatever, the second since the microsecond since epoch time. We can turn that back into a time value in the same format and then write that theoretically. So like there are ways to get around it. But yeah, I don't know. How does any of that sound?
I'm really interested in the last thing you just said. Like, if you can kind of like reverse it and be like, oh, we do have this cache key. That's really fascinating.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not sure. And this is kind of one of those things with performance in general. Like I love talking about performance work, and typically people only see like one pull request of mine, and what they don't see is there's another 10 pull requests that instead of 1%, like 10% gain, it's like 1% gain. And what they don't see beyond that is like there's another 100 ideas that I've attempted and it just didn't work. It didn't pan out. I mean, in general, like doing performance work is essentially refactoring, but refactoring with you're trying to preserve the exact behavior. And ideally, like if everything goes right, then you can preserve the exact behavior without and make things faster. And then whenever you test it, then it you can actually prove that it got faster and prove that nothing changed. Like that's the ideal world. Most really, really, really large performance requests or performance improvements are not necessarily that. Like that's the ideal case. The other of the performance things that you can do is in this case, like you're actually changing the behavior. So where it's close, it's still doing the same thing. Like it's still generating a cache key. It's still valid for all of the things it's supposed to do. It's just not like if you were to call it a refactoring, it's not a refactoring because it's actually a change in behavior.
Right. Yeah. It's one, and a lot of times those things, your previous approach was not ideal, and so you don't really want your improvement to be backwards compatible because it would still be slow then.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, there's like people like, oh, well, can't you take that string and like reformat it to be this other thing? It's like, yes, I mean, we could by doing what we used to do, which is slow. It's the slow thing. Yeah, and it's just like so many of the like that process that I described where it's like I run a profiling tool, I find a hotspot, I try to make it faster, or I try to avoid. Oh, sorry, my computer just went to sleep.
We still hear you. So.
Okay, well that's good. Luckily, I didn't go to sleep. I guess that made me a little bit more quieter. Yeah, and so you like there's several things to verify. So I can tell you where a hotspot is, but I can't necessarily guarantee you that there's going to be any sort of a meaningful change possible at that location. And then I can't guarantee you that it's possible to maybe not even get to that location and not ever call that hotspot. And then even if that's the case, if I can say, yes, this is a change worth making, I can't guarantee you that I can make that change in a way that's acceptable, that preserves behavior enough. Like I actually, I was doing some performance work, and just in a test, I made one change and accidentally made code triage about 50% faster. And I was like, this is amazing. like how do I tell the world this? And I was like, hold on. And then I was like, okay, well, the next step is like, okay, well, let's actually make this as an actual change. Let's get all of the tests passing. And I got down to every single test passing except for one. And this is actually kind of scary. Every single test passing except for one. And then realized that I had essentially it was so fast because I literally cut out half of the work that it was doing in like not a good way. It's like not half of the work that I can skip. Like basically instead of rendering 50 different partials that were cached of 50 different repos. It's like I was rendering the same one 50 different times. And it's like, hey, but everybody, it's faster, right? Like faster isn't always it's always a trade-off, and that was not a good trade-off.
Yeah.
So that it's just kind of it's sort of a bit of an emotional roller coaster anytime I'm doing this work. Where I don't want to get my hopes up, and I don't want to, even with this change, it's not actually merged in yet. And they've said that yes, it is beneficial enough, and that performance benefit is high enough. I mean, because it's like every single cached page you have, it's like, oh, that like 10, 11% faster. The trade-off is that whenever you deploy this, then yes, the first hit everything will be cold cache, which is not ideal. So it's also tough from a maintainer perspective as well, I think, to try and have to make these trade-offs for people who, they can comment on the issue, and they can, comment on podcasts and whatnot. But otherwise can't really express exactly how they would like this dealt with.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's going to affect thousands of apps, so your decisions at that level are like, you have to try and assume what's best for all of these people, even though you have no idea how their apps are built and what they depend upon. That's got to be a very hard decision.
Yep. Yeah. So if all of the stars align and you can do all of those things, then you can get a performance pull request in.
Yeah,
I don't recommend starting with performance work.
So for recently I've seen you tweet a lot about just different performance gains and things like that. Are you finding these through this tool you've written? Like, are you mostly just kind of throwing it against code triage and looking for pain points, or how do you find those?
Yeah. So, relatively rarely, sometimes someone will actually report something like, hey, this got slower in some meaningful way. Like, oh, I went from this version to this version and I got slower. In this case, so that is one way. Another way is with static analysis. There's a project called Rubocop that most people know for code linting and enforcement of style. So if you want to say, oh, I want 2 spaces instead of 4, it will blow up at you if you don't follow that style. The other thing it can do is there are known patterns that are faster than other patterns inside of Ruby. So for example, if you're matching a regular expression with the somebody called it the bacon cannon. It's like equals and then squiggly, equals and then tilde. That is much, much slower than in Ruby 2.5. They introduced the dot match with a question mark. And the reason is that if you're using the bacon cannon, it allocates these magic variables. If you've ever used $1, $2, or to access matches inside of that regular expression, it does that even if I think even if you're not using them. So if we can look at your code and see, okay, you're using the bacon cannon, but you're not using any of those magic variables, then we can safely switch over to this, match with a question mark, and it will effectively do the same thing and be faster. So that is one way to do it. Unfortunately, with that method, you don't actually know if it's a hotspot or not. And everybody has a different philosophy on this. If I am of the mindset with some of the changers, like that one for instance, you can make that change and it doesn't affect the code quality or readability or anything, and it just makes it faster. Like if you're maintaining a library like Rails, then yes, if you're using some, or Puma, I'm also a maintainer of Puma, then all of those things should roughly be worth making the change, whether or not it's a hotspot. I don't know if you saw this, but I wrote my very first performance cop, which detects if you have an array and you call array.compact.flatten.map. Whatever, Like a lot of people just do string those methods onto it, and whenever you do that, it allocates another array. Like .compact doesn't modify the current array; it returns a new array.
Right.
Yeah, and so they're like, if you're writing really, really performance sensitive code, then in the cases where you call .compact, okay, well, you returned a new array, so we can mutate it. So now you called another method. So now instead of .map, you can call .map with a bang and mutate that first one, and it's faster.
And that's actually a cop, like for RuboCop?
Yeah, so I don't know if it's been released yet or not, but yeah, I made a pull request to RuboCop, and when I ran it against Rails, I actually found about 100 offenses.
Oh, wow.
Well, yeah. Also, I opened up a pull request that fixed all of them, and they were like, no. But I mean, because again, it's all trade-offs, and in this case, the code quality was definitely worse because those bang methods, like map bang, can either return the original array. Well, actually, I don't know if map bang can, but some of them, like compact, if there's no nils, then it will return nil.
Yeah.
As opposed to the original array, so you can't actually chain them. You have to like rewrite it to use an intermediate variable. And essentially, they were just saying, if one of these things is in a hotspot, then we'll consider it. But so that is kind of another method of making things faster, of just kind of like statically, irrespective of anything else. Now, the most effective way that I've been able to make projects faster is with finding some sort of a tool, some sort of a benchmarking tool, typically for all the Rails work I've been doing, derailed benchmarks and memory allocation, and just looking at where are we allocating memory. And yeah, like what I kind of described is pretty similar with almost all of my changes. Like, with one of them, I made try, I think 35% faster ish.
Yeah, I remember seeing that one.
That rules so much.
Yeah, and it's used internally inside of Rails all the time. So even if you're not using it, and when I first made, I ran derailed benchmarks against code triage, and it pointed to this line number inside of try. And like, it's one of those things where you just look at it and it's this like completely innocuous line, and you're like, wait, there's no memory allocation here. And then over time you realize, oh, hey, when in this case, it's like if you call a method with args in it, like splat args, like if you're splatting an array in a method, and you pass in another method, it actually will allocate an array for that.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So I mean, it's like this super, super subtle thing where, and we got rid of it by basically just taking the code in this other method that it was basically like calling a helper method. And so instead of calling that helper method, I just put that logic, reproduce that logic inside of the original method. But like before I did that, I had never really thought about like the behavior of splat in that case. Or like there's another one, a really strange one I found with file open, where if you're trying to write something via file open, it's something really small, it buffers a set amount of memory regardless of how much you're trying to write to that file.
I didn't know.
Yeah, I know. Neither did I. and it's one of these things where it's like afterwards, like I will open this pull request and I'll talk about it, and people are like, wow, that's like it's amazing that you knew that. And it's like, well, I didn't know that.
I learned it.
It's like, yeah, my tooling showed me there's an allocation on this line, and I said, no, there can't be. Like, there's not an allocation on that, or it can't be that large. And then it's an issue of like, how can we reproduce it? Like, can I pull this out into just a one-off script and then use memory profiler directly? And like, once I say, okay, definitely there is an issue with this, then the question is there a way to do the same, have the same logic, but in a more efficient way? And in that scenario, you can call sync. Like if you have a file object, you can call sync equals true on it, and then it doesn't buffer the write if it's just a really, really small file, right?
Does this stuff ever lead you to, diving into the Ruby source code to figure out what's going on behind the scenes?
Occasionally, like many, many, many years ago, I think that probably one of the best examples is any and empty inside of for array. So on array, people often want to check and see if it's empty, so they'll call dot empty. And then a lot of people want to do the opposite of that and see if there's anything in the array and call dot any. Unfortunately, they're not actually opposites. Like dot any does more than not empty. If that makes sense.
Is there a reason for that? I can understand there might be a case for it, but nothing comes to mind off the top of my head.
Without this is one of those things, like without looking at the source code, I'm probably going to butcher this. So definitely look at the source code. I think it checks the values to see if they're like nil.
Oh, to make sure, yeah, because there's probably a case where it's like, it wants to consider it any only if the items inside of the array are not nil or the array is empty or something.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, is there anything in this array? Well, if it's an array full of nils, no.
Right.
So the inverse of that doesn't work. So like when you say like dot empty, it just is looking, I guess, like at length, or is it actually looking at values too?
I would have to look at the source code.
It seems weird that those aren't, exactly the same or opposites, but at the same time, like you may have to introduce two other methods to handle sort of like, and how would you even name those? Like, is the length greater than 0, but just nils or whatever? Like, be really hard.
You just get these really long.
Yeah.
Question.
It's like any underscore except underscore nil except underscore. Yeah. And so I mean, there's like little small things like that. Actually one of the things I haven't looked into, but whenever you use marshal.dump, even so marshal dump doesn't immediately generate the dumped string, which I thought it did.
Yeah.
Instead, it returns an IO object, which basically, if you're writing to a file, which 99% of the time people are doing, then like it can just get streamed to disk. So like that's good. But for some weird reason, even if you're doing that, where you're like basically streaming the marshal.dump to a file, it still allocates like a string that is, I don't even know how long, like 20, 30 characters long. So like that is I would probably have to look inside of the source to figure out why it's doing that. And I'm sure there's probably a good reason. Like maybe that's like a header or something like that it needs to generate, or it before it can actually do the streaming or something. Yeah. And like I'm also more and more interested in, like, at some point in time you kind of max out on what you're able to performance optimize in Ruby land.
Yeah, but I mean, what's really fascinating is like how much you can accomplish just by measuring your Ruby code and then paying attention to, okay, if you are doing heavy maps or compacts or whatever, like just mutate and it will be faster, or use less memory or whatever. And you can do so much just by monitoring your Ruby code that way, without even ever having to dive into, how does the language work internally. You can kind of just figure out the pieces of how the language works internally that you need to know, and that's it, which is awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will also say, anybody who's listening, if you're like, oh, I want to make my app 10% faster, does that mean I need to make a pull request to Rails? Like, probably not. Like 99% of apps I've ever worked on or ever seen, like performance wise, it's just like the performance problems are not in Rails and it's not in Ruby. It's like, it's because you did something like you loaded 1,000 active record objects into memory at once.
Yep.
And like like application level benchmarking for things like that. Like using tools. I really like Scout. I really like Skylight. Both of those are really good. And it's just like anybody, you can see huge changes. It's like, because you can specialize the behavior of your exact application versus when I'm making this kind of a change in Rails, it's got to be good not just for your application, it has to be good for everyone's.
Where would you tell people to start? What do you think's probably a good place, or what's a tool they should grab to start doing this in their own apps?
If you don't already, install Rack Mini Profiler and just run that in development. And basically what Rack Mini Profiler does is it will give you a little badge. It will render a badge in the UI as you're browsing your app, and it will tell you how many milliseconds it took to render that. And then if you click on the badge, it will give you more information, such as how many SQL requests were made. And you can do there's other stuff you can do with it as well that are a little bit more advanced, but just that alone, being kind of casually aware of um, sort of the general state of your performance as you're developing, I think is huge. Like most develop like that. That is like the flossing the single tooth of application performance work, of just like being vaguely aware of what is going on performance wise. And I would say most issues that I see are memory related inside of Rails, and 99% of the memory related ones are related to some misuse of databases somehow. Like loading all of the records when you only needed, the first one, or just
Yeah.
like kind of silly stuff like that. And then if you have like a Rack Mini Profiler and or some tool like that, then while you're developing, it's like, oh, I added this feature, and for some reason, it's showing me like 100 extra database queries. What's going on?
Yeah, that's one of the things I've noticed most, like growing as a developer. Like, I'm still relatively fresh. Like 2012 is when I started, and like a lot of the like performance problems I ran into kind of early on, like were just me being like either not understanding or just like being inefficient at the things I was doing.
Mm-hmm.
And like the I guess like the older I get, the more seasoned of a developer I become, whatever. Like if Ruby and Rails, like as a tool, like it does what it does like really well. Like sure, like there's some rough edges, but most like performance wise, like I have tools available to me that I can use just to like write better and faster code.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
absolutely.
One of your previous points reminded me, I think DHH was the one that like tweeted about this or something, with like, everyone sees the n+1 query problem and goes to eager load everything. And he was like, if you're using Russian doll caching, like you don't need to load every single item when one thing breaks. You need to only query for that one to-do item or whatever that changed, so you can rebuild your entire cache that way. And I was like, yeah, like you have to actually be aware of what actually is going on. If somebody gives you advice to never write n+1 queries, that's very blanket advice and probably doesn't always apply.
Yeah. If n is 0, then it's then that's fine, right? n+1. I'm doing n+1 queries. N is 0.
Right.
Yeah. I think for production apps, what I see a lot at Heroku is like if you're having issues in production, start off with figuring out what your endpoints that just take the longest, like typically, and then in those look for memory allocation.
I really liked Skylight has their sort by agony, which is like the speed of the query or the request, but also by how many times it's requested, which is a great way to figure out what's the best place you could probably start optimizing.
I didn't know they did that.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite things about that.
We've been using Scout pretty exclusively. By we, I mean where I work and then my side projects.
Mhm.
And like there is like fewer things in life right now that bring me much joy than like a really slow response time
Mhm.
and like turning on caching or something like fragment caching or something like that, or like reducing allocations and just watching those numbers like come down. It's like that's my zen.
Totally. Yeah, I another like big thing is people will do is like load a bunch of records just to count them.
Oh yeah, I've done that too, you know, like when you're I feel like you at the beginning you're just trying to make the feature work or whatever. And so you're just like, okay, this seems to do the trick. And then you know, you're not even paying attention to memory usage or anything, and it's fast enough. You don't notice it. And then, you know, at some point you're like, wait a minute, this takes like 10 seconds to count all these records or whatever.
Is this an example of the Ruby has sharp knives? What is that from? Is that a DHH thing?
It was, wasn't it?
I think it might be in the Rails doctrine. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Sounds really familiar.
Or Ruby has sharp knives. I don't know. Anyway.
Oh, I forgot the best resource is going to Schneems.com and subscribing to my blog. That was Schneems.com and subscribe to the
title.
Blog.
You need a blog post about, you know, flossing one tooth.
I do.
Yeah, you need your catchphrase.
That's hey, like floss one tooth. Like you didn't say it, but I just did like the finger point thing. And then also actually Nate Berkopec writes a lot of really good performance stuff. You could find him, I think it's speedshop.co maybe.
Yeah, I'm
Rails. Oh yeah, he has a book called Rails Speed.
I use his complete guide to Rails performance course to do some of these changes I did at work as far as like understanding caching and things like that. And I can't recommend it enough.
Yeah. Also, there's a Slack. If you buy the book, you get in the Slack, and I'm in the Slack. It's like the only third party Slack that like I'm in that I actually participate in. That I really like it, just because it's like, oh, other people are dealing with like performance stuff, and like I posted some of my performance work stuff, and like somebody commented like, hey, I found like I wrote this benchmark and like found out that like told me something I didn't even know. So that was kind of
that's really cool.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Richard, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
We don't know. We still don't know what we're doing, so thanks for coming along the ride with us.
Neither do I.
I was on a podcast the other day, and one thing I thought was really cool is at the end he gave me a chance to like kind of mention anything I wanted to talk about. Doesn't have to be like programming related.
It doesn't even have to be flossing related.
Yeah, well, we open it up. So I was curious if you had anything you wanted to say, like, yeah, anything you're interested in outside of programming, whatever. Floor is yours.
Can I say something like incredibly politically charged?
Sure, why not?
So I live in Texas, and I am desperately trying to repeal and replace Ted Cruz. So that I have repeal and replace TedCruz.com is my one of my.
I didn't know that was yours. I've seen that floating around.
Yeah, it's probably me hawking that. Okay, so that's my political, my programmer. I got an Ergodox keyboard. That's pretty sweet. For house stuff. Oh, go ahead.
Were you mechanical keyboard before that?
So I have mechanical keyboards. I have some other mechanical keyboards, but I'm not one of those mechanical keyboard only people. Like I had prior to that some like gaming keyboards. I had the Corsair RGB with Cherry MX silence because I don't want my wife to divorce me.
Clickety clack.
Yeah, I also have a another keyboard with browns and like no like O-rings or anything, and just like every single time I use it, she's like, "Can you stop? Can you not?" So yeah, I got this one. This one has clears on it, and I put O-rings so it doesn't keep everybody up. But yeah, I really like the split hands and the like ortholinear, and that's really nice. It took me forever to get used to it. Like I was I was typing at about, I don't know, a 8th grade level or something for a couple of weeks. But
yeah, I was curious because I see a lot of people.
yeah, I think you heard that.
Yeah, I actually thought it was my dog. So,
oh, can I recommend dachshunds? They're great and hilarious looking, except they bark a lot.
Yeah, we have a terrier mix, and we actually just had to put her on Prozac because she loses her mind. Like somebody could drop a piece of like paper outside. Chris has met her. Like she wants to rip your head off if you enter our front door. So
yeah, small dog. Yeah, small dog syndrome.
Yeah.
Totally. When he barks with like his whole body. I think he gets a couple inches shorter.
Awesome. Anything else?
I just had my second kid. So kids, can I recommend kids?
Sure.
They're pretty great. We
have number 2 coming between today and October 9th. So
exciting times. Yeah. And that like waiting is awful.
Oh, yeah. I don't know. The first one came a couple of weeks early. And so now I'm really impatient. I'm like, are you sure he can't come at 36 weeks?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Same thing with us. We were like, okay, well, the first one was a week early, so this one's going to be a week early. And it's like, wait a second, they missed the deadline. Come on, kid. We got stuff going on.
Yeah.
Did you get my Google Calendar invite?
It's like I'm going to be upset if he doesn't get here until his due date. And he has a due date for a reason. So maybe I just don't understand medical things.
When it happens, it happens.
Just procrastinating.
Go with the flow. Yeah. Let's start a lifelong. Oh yeah, the other day I had a huge life decision to make, and I procrastinated on it for a couple months, and then it just resolved itself. So after that, I am not making any other life decisions without procrastinating on it for a couple of months.
Man, if only life just functioned that way.
I know, right?
I'd be a millionaire. Cool. Where can the people find you on the internet?
I'm Schneems. That's SCHNEEMS, which is part of my last name of Schneeman, which is also German for snowman.
Cool.
Yeah. So
today I learned.
Yeah, there you go. And I am Schneems everything. I'm Schneems GitHub, Twitter, Schneems.com. I think I'm on Mastodon as well. I'm not actually logged in again after the initial login, but Schneems there on the Ruby social, ruby.social.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Cool. Chris, we don't usually do this, but where can people find you?
Twitter.com/exid3, EXCID3. And pretty much anywhere else, GitHub, you name it. GoRails.com.
GoRails.com. You can find me, JM Charns, and if you're interested in more of this podcast, you can subscribe to this in all the places. Remote Ruby is actually a online meetup that used to happen every month and will probably happen again in the fall. So if you're interested in that, remoteruby.net maybe. I don't even remember the website.
Google.
Cool. Well, Richard, thanks so much for joining us, and it's been a blast. Hopefully we can do this again soon one day.
Yeah, this was amazing. Thanks for having me on. Take it easy.